Good evening and welcome to tonight's Global Conversation in Literacy with Dr. Candace Kuby. We are hosting tonight from Georgia State University located in downtown Atlanta. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter at hashtag GCLR. Your moderators for this evening will be Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, and me, Christy Pace, doctoral student at Georgia State University. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. We are currently conducting research on the nature of technology-mediated interactions between and among participants within literacy-focused web seminars. Areas of interest include the issues, affordances, and constraints of this technology as it relates to GCLR. For more information on our seminars, please visit our website to learn about upcoming events, including the 2011-2012 series. Here, you can also retrieve information about our presenters. We invite anyone interested in presenting a web seminar to please contact Dr. Peggy Albers at the email address you see here at the bottom of your screen. We want you to feel free to interact during the presentation. You may do this by typing in the chat area any questions and responses you may have during the webinar. Those of you who have joined us before will recognize this interactive map. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. And this cluster map indicates locations from where GCLR webinar participants interact. Everyone, if you would, please take a moment, locate the wand. It's a sparkly-looking device there to the left of the slide. Take your wand and click on the map from where you're listening at this time. Wow, it looks as though we have a cross-section of participants joining us from all over. We are delighted to have you with us in this evening's important literacy research conversation. And once again, if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, please type them into the chat area. Dr. Albers and I will monitor these as best we can during the presentation, during the webinar, and then at the conclusion of her presentation, Dr. Kuby will have an opportunity to address your questions as well. Dr. Kuby began her career teaching early childhood students, spending more than a decade working with students in several national and international locations. She earned a doctorate in literacy, culture, and language education from Indiana University. Along with her many publications, research projects, presentations, and service to the profession, Dr. Kuby remains an active member in several professional organizations. Some of her many research interests include critical inquiry, qualitative research methods, and spatial literacy, to name a few. At present, Dr. Kuby continues work in literacy research at the University of Missouri, Columbia, where she is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning, Teaching, and Curriculum. She is also the author of several publications concerning language and literacy, so please feel free to check those out on the GCLR website. Several of them are on the screen before you. Without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Candace Kuby and her presentation entitled Tensions from Analyzing Children's Images of Racial Bus Segregation, Searching for Tools. Let's give her a virtual round of applause by clicking on the hand icon located on your under your participant screen underneath the participant window. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kuby now.
Candace, you may need to turn your mic back on.
Thank you, Peggy. Thanks, Christy. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can. That's great.
All right. Well, I just want to say thanks again to Peggy and Christy for helping me get all this organized and for moderating tonight. And thank you to all of those who have decided to join us tonight. I see a lot of names of people I know and then a lot of new names, so it's good to meet you virtually. So as Christy said, the title of my talk tonight is Tensions from Analyzing Children's Images of Racial Best Segregation, Searching for Tools. And I use the title Searching for Tools because I feel that this session is more about tensions or struggles in the research process that I had while looking at some images that 5- and 6-year-olds drew related to Rosa Parks. So I'm really going to focus on 5 different tensions tonight, and I'm going to give us some space to explore those together. I've set up the webinar tonight to be interactive in 2 ways. One, I'm going to stop several times throughout the presentation and ask for questions. I know that you can type in the chat box throughout the presentation, and I think that Peggy and Christy will help me if there seems to be a good number of questions. They'll help me to kind of focus in and answer those as we stop. And also, several times through the night, I'm going to have some images on the screen and ask us to analyze them together interactively as we go. So that will give you a space to also type in the chat box your responses and reactions to the children's images. So these are the 5 questions or tensions that I'm going to take us through tonight to think about when it comes to analyzing images that children create and draw. One is, when I started the process of looking at these drawings from students, I was really familiar with Van Leeuwen and Jewett's work with the visual of grammar design. But as I tried that out on the images, it didn't quite get me or help me explore the questions that I was interested in. And so I'm going to help us think through that and think how can we move beyond that or build upon that body of scholarship. The second tension is, when we look at children's drawings, especially related to social justices, how do we go about analyzing those in a way to understand from a teacher's perspective, from a researcher's perspective, what they understand about that social injustice? The third tension is, as I began to look through these images that children had drawn, I felt a lot of emotions as I interacted with them. It brought up a lot of anger in me and thoughts related to racial segregation. And so I searched for a tool to help me analyze them from an emotional standpoint. The fourth tension I want to talk about is related to children that we work with over time. And if we have experiences in classrooms when we read different picture books, have different conversations, if we learn about their lives outside of schools and the type of religious institutions and family experiences that children have, how did these all get layered into the drawings that they create in classrooms? And so how can we better understand not just the image itself, but to contextualize it with the life and the living experiences of the children? And the last tension that I want to explore tonight is, when looking at images, is our purpose to find out what it means? Are we searching for the meaning of the image, and should this be the goal of research? And I pose that based on some comments I've gotten as I've shared these pictures before, comments from reviewers and journals, and that's something that I've struggled with thinking about. Is the purpose of analyzing images to find a meaning, or is it more about an experience or interaction that each viewer has with the images? So we'll scoot on, and I want to just contextualize a little bit these images that I'm talking about. So the work that I did and the data I collected came from a summer enrichment program. I was the classroom teacher, and I was also researching, so I positioned this as teacher research. And it was located in the southern United States, and the class that I had were children who had just finished kindergarten. So they were about 5 and 6 years old, and I had about 25 students throughout the summer. And the first week of the summer program together, we were outside on the playground, and there was a group of teachers that yelled at my students from the door and insisted that children cannot sit on the bench, that benches are for adults. And I really wasn't sure what to do about this. I didn't know the teachers because we were in a summer program and we came from different schools to teach. So I just sat there and not sure what to do. I brought it back up to the children the next morning in a class meeting together. And we began talking about if we thought it was fair. and how we might respond to this. And over the next few days, I had an assumption, which might not have been a good assumption as I look back on it, but since this was located in the South and there was a civil rights museum in the city, that some of them might have had an understanding about Rosa Parks. And so I made a connection to her, having to get up, or being demanded because of the laws to get up out of her bench on the bus. And we talked a little bit about how these were different, that we weren't equating the bus situation to what happened on our playground, but they were both about power. And so we used this as a historical piece to explore what was happening in our lives and what happened in Rosa Parks' life. So about 4 weeks later, as we had been exploring Rosa Parks, I started to notice that the students were not thinking about the multiple perspectives that might have happened on the day that Rosa Parks was on the bus. So I created this learning engagement based on the book Voices in the Park by Anthony Brown. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a post-structural picture book, and there's 4 sections of the book, and each section is a different voice of these characters that go to the park on the same day. And so I used this as a parallel text structure, and we created our own book called Voices on the Bus. And you can see on the screen, on the right-hand side, a couple of webs. So the assistant teacher and I divided the students in 4 groups. And the 4 voices were Rosa Parks' voice, the white bus driver, the other African American, and the other European Americans, or the other white people that had been on the bus that day. So we used conversations from the students and these webs to write the text for the book, and then we had the students illustrate with watercolors and Sharpies the images that I'm going to talk about tonight. So the book itself is about 20 pages, but I'm not going to go through the whole book, but I just wanted to give you a little flavor of some of the pages in the book before we hone in on a few for analysis. So here's the cover. And here's one sample page. This was written in the section from Rosa Parks' voice. It says, I wanted to sit in the front of the bus because I believed the law that said black people had to sit only in the back of the bus was unfair. And you can see how the student drew a line and wrote front and back. Another example page, when she didn't get up, I said, you might get arrested. And this came from the section on the book from the bus driver. I looked around and saw that other black people had sad faces because Rosa was getting arrested. And this is the image that we're going to look at closer later in the evening. And the final sample is this page that said, we noticed that Rosa wouldn't look at the bus driver because she knew she'd get arrested for not giving up her seat. And we'll look at this one closer as well. So that's just a couple of pages or examples to show you the book that we created as a class. So I want to start with this quote. This is a quote that I read. It was from NRC, or now the Literacy Research Association's yearbook from 2009 by Siegel and Panofsky. And it really resonated with me as I was beginning to look for literature and theories to help support how I might analyze these images. It says, if the studies of multimodality are to contribute to the reimagining and redesign of literacy education in schools, it needs to be located within contemporary discourses about literacies, diversities, and power so as to offer a full account of meaning making. Just as multimodality involves the generative juxtapositioning of different sign systems that contradict and balance one another, we think it might be similarly fruitful to approach the analysis of multimodality with a hybrid of different theories and analytic tools. A social semiotic theory of multimodality is a valuable resource, but it does not stand alone. And the part I really resonate with from this quote is that I was looking at these images, and while I could approach it simply from a social semiotic standpoint of analyzing it, I realized that there were so many histories and layers and emotions and understandings about critical events such as Rosa Parks that I needed to have a tool that would help me unpack those areas as well. And so I started to search for a hybrid or different theories that would help me analyze these images. So I want to stop for just a second and see if there's any questions before we go on and talk through these 5 tensions that I introduced at the beginning. I'm not sure, Peggy and Christy, if you've noticed any questions yet on the chat board.
Actually, Candace, could you just maybe talk a little bit about what a social semiotic theory of multimodality is for our listeners?
Sure. Well, the way I understand that is semiotics is a way of communicating, sign systems of communicating. And so the social part on that would include the ways that people in relation to one another use different sign systems to communicate and to represent their understanding, their knowledge, and meaning. And so when I think about that, I think about multimodality as well. And so there's different modes and ways that we communicate. So, you know, images and painting is one. We also communicate through speaking, through alphabetic. We also communicate through gaze and through our bodies and the movements that we have. And so a social semiotic theory would then look at the different modes that people use to communicate and study the different ways about communicating. Does that help some, Peggy, or does somebody else want to chime in with another understanding?
Yeah, I think so. Eva does have a question, and I'm not sure if you'll be addressing this later. She says, how do you approach the curriculum design of a unit like this?
Sure. Well, for me, the way I went into that teaching that summer was I was really wanting to kid watch and listen to things happening in children's lives as a starting place or a springboard for our curriculum. And so when I noticed the incident that happened on our playground, I thought that might be something to talk with the kids about and see what their response was. There were other incidences that happened as well that I would consider, you know, moments of injustices or areas that we could have talked about, but this was one that I chose to bring back to them. And the way I designed it after that was really following their questions. They had lots of questions about Rosa Parks. Many of them were not aware of who she was and that it took place so close to where they lived. So based on their questions, we continued to explore her. They had questions about segregation in general, not just about on the bus. They had questions about even slavery, and so it just kept unfolding and unraveling based on some of the interest they had from the books we read and the research we did on the internet. Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, Barbara had a question. She would like to know, what do Siegel and Panofsky suggest beyond a social semiotic theory?
Candace, you can turn your mic back on. We have to sort of alternate between mics so we don't get reverberation.
That's an interesting question, Barbara. The quote here actually comes from the very end of that yearbook chapter, so it's more in the conclusion or discussion section, and it wasn't, you know, the beginning of the chapter where they then expanded on that throughout. I think this was more of a call to researchers to think beyond that, but they didn't give us answers in that particular piece. So I took it up as more of a call or a way to encourage us to think beyond a social semiotic theory and to think about other ways if we're going to account for diversity and power and other contemporary discourses, how might we do that?
Okay, great. Thanks, Candace. I think you can just go ahead and move on with your presentation.
Okay, so we're going to start now by exploring some of these tensions that I mentioned at the beginning. The first tension was I tried out a visual of grammar design analysis on the images first because that's what I was familiar with. It was a starting place for me. And if you're not familiar with this approach for analysis, the focus is on looking at things within the image or the piece of artwork, such as lines, the image of the position, the arrangement, the angles, the perceptions, the viewer, the gaze, the size. So there's a lot of detail on how to go about that and dividing the image into 4 quadrants and looking at it. So for tonight, I just want us to try that out. I'm going to show an image in just a second, and I want you to think about, when you look at the image, the grammar of the image, the structure of the image, and think about what you get from analyzing it related to colors, lines, vectors, angles, and positionality. So this is the first image that I want us to look at. So you can use your chat space, and if you were to look at this image together, what are the kind of things that you would notice through analysis if you were solely using a visual grammar design perspective? So there's lots of suggestions popping up. So some of us are noticing the colors of the people by the color of the watercolors the student chose to indicate where the African American people were sitting. Some of you noticed the way that it seems to get smaller toward the back. So I think Peggy mentioned the diagonal that moves from the bottom left to the upper right. So thinking about positionality. I don't know if you're able to see clearly also, but the way that they used some of them have really distinct facial features, so you can see some of them have really distinct frowns, while others don't have any lips or smiles, and so you can even look closely at the details such as that. And so those were the exact same kind of things that I was thinking about as I looked at it from this perspective. Some of you mentioned the line down the middle also, and the words to indicate what section of the bus, and the color of the clothes they had, where the African Americans all had the same color, while there was a range of colors and clothing on the people that were sitting in the front. So as I went through the images, this helped me a little bit, but it still didn't help me make sense completely of how the children were making sense of this critical inquiry, what they understood about segregation, and it didn't really help me to get at the layered histories that children brought to drawing this image or the emotions involved. So I kept searching for other tools that might help me. So the second tension I was wrestling with is that notion of how do we look at kids' representations through art and understand what their perspective is about a social justice issue. So there's two quotes here that I really resonated with as I was looking at these images. And one is that when kids construct their drawings, it provides us insight, so researchers and teachers, into the personal experiences of these students in the complex world that they live in. And then also this one by Peggy that talks about how visual constructions of meaning reveal students' beliefs about social locations such as gender, race, class, sexual orientation. So I'm going to ask us to look at this picture again, the same picture, and if we take a perspective of a critical inquiry, and when I think about that, I think about looking for things in the picture that would help me to know how this student understands power, how they understand position, how they might understand privilege in the world, how they might understand social injustices. So if you can take a second looking at the same image, what are some things that you notice if you were to analyze this through a perspective of critical inquiry, looking for position, power, privilege, understandings about the world? Right, so a lot of us are noting the size of the bus driver, so we might wonder if this indicates the way the child understands the position or the power that the bus driver had over the people riding the bus. And so what I understood as I looked at it this way was similar to what some of you were chatting. It seemed to me that this student understands the rules of the bus when it comes to bus segregation, that there was specific places that people were supposed to sit. It also seemed clear that the student understood the feelings of people in different parts of the bus. So you can notice that the African Americans in the back of the bus, the student drew their faces with frowns, so maybe indicating to us how they might have felt not getting to choose where they wanted to sit on the bus. And that also indicates to me maybe the power relations that the student was trying to make sense of or understand during this time of civil rights and bus segregation. But there are several comments I think that's interesting. And go back up to a question I think that somebody asked, how do we know? Is it just that the children ran out of space and maybe they just started driving the bus driver first and so it's larger and then they ran out of space toward the end? So I'm going to come back to that question of how do we know. It's the fifth tension that I want us to wrestle with, but I do want you to know that I saw the comment and I want us to come back to that. So as I continued to analyze these, I had several conversations with other colleagues, and they would indicate to me that these pictures seemed to evoke a lot of emotions in them, that there were so many aspects of the images that stirred up anger, that evoked, possibly a fear in how people felt on the bus. And so I wanted something that would help me to unpack or to understand the way that students used emotions and the way they were processing racial bus segregation. And so I want to talk a little bit about this notion of emotions as performed. So as I began to read literature on emotions, there's a range of perspectives. One is that emotions happen inside us. It's a psychological or cognitive stance to looking at emotions, that they happen within the individual. And then I began to read emotions as something that happens socially, that it happens in between people, and that we respond to people with our emotions because of something that somebody else has said or done. And then I got into some of the literature on emotions as a verb, and that was an interesting concept to me because I've never really thought of emotions as a verb. But this literature talks about that emotions are something we do and the collisions of contact. And so if we're going to study emotions as a verb, we have to think about them as a performance, and that's something that we embody and something that we do. And so I was struggling with thinking about how do we analyze these images for these evoked emotions, that this performance of emotion. And so I asked myself the question, what does the reading of this text do to me or to us? What kind of emotions are evoked in me as I analyze the images that these students create? And so a couple of points related to that is when I think about the literature on critical inquiry, sometimes it comes across more analytical to me. For example, if we read particular children's books related to a social injustice and we ask certain questions at the end of the book, then we've done critical literacy. But to me that comes across very more analytical and rational. And I started thinking about the work of Freire and other scholars who worked with many groups of people who were struggling through oppression and thought that that's really emotional work that they're doing together. And perhaps the way we've taken up critical inquiry in schools doesn't highlight that or allow spaces for those emotions to be performed. And so then I also thought about a talk that I heard last year around this time, and I think Dave might be joining us tonight. But David Bloom was talking about, at a multimodality conference, about maybe our focus should not so much be on the image, but the interaction with an image when we look at analysis. And so that really resonated with me, and it goes back to the question that somebody posed a few minutes ago, that perhaps it's not so much about the intention of the artist and what they were intending to do, but perhaps it's the interaction that we have with the image itself that's really important. And so I connect this to this notion of emotion as something that we perform. So I'm going to ask us to try another analysis together. And it's a different image, but I want you to share with us, as you look at this image, what are the emotions that are evoked in you? What is your interaction, your response to this particular image? And not to focus on what the intention perhaps of the child was, but your own evoked response as you look at it. So I think it's interesting. Christy brought up this point that the bus driver looks mean or angry, but the rider looks happy. And that was something that I noticed as I looked at this. It evoked at first this feeling of frustration and anger in me because of the finger that this bus driver is pointing at Rosa Parks. But then I had to look at it a little bit deeper and think about, well, she's smiling, and why might that be? And so I have to think historically about that this was not a haphazard moment on the bus, that it was a planned protest within a larger movement of people. And so perhaps there was something in her that she knew she was taking a stand for something that was larger than her, for change. And so I had a mixture of emotions as I looked at this picture, the emotions of the bus driver, the emotions of Rosa. So as I continued to look at these images as well, I was thinking about, I had a lot of history and knowledge with these students before they started painting these images. We had been together for 4 weeks, and we had read lots of picture books related to Rosa Parks, related to the civil rights movement in a larger perspective. And I knew that those conversations were influencing how they were drawing or creating these paintings together. I had also done some parental questionnaires where I talked with the parents, and they had responded to me in ways related to what they talk about at home related to race, what they do at home related to people who might be different than them, and how they have those conversations at home. Some of them referenced religious teachings from different religious institutions that they were a part of. And so I knew that I couldn't just look at the images without the context of the child as a whole. And so I wanted to be able to take that into perspective as I analyzed these images. And so I'm not going to ask you to respond to this one as much because you don't know the students, but I want to share with you a little bit to demonstrate what I mean by that. If I was to look at this image that Carson drew, we can look at it by the colors, the size, the position. We can look at it to think about what does he know about racial segregation. We can think about the evoked emotions. But I also knew that I had had conversations with Carson before, and many times the discourse of fairness would be brought up. He was a child that was always talking about what is fair. And so that was something I knew filtered into how he drew this image. Also in this image, what sticks out to me are the eyes of Rosa Parks. You can see they're very large with yellow, and they really pop out. You feel like she's looking right into you when you see this image. And this was something that I knew Carson had talked about previously. So for example, this is a transcript when Carson was talking with my assistant teacher, and he was looking through several picture books related to Rosa Parks. And this happened several days before he drew the painting on the previous slide. And so Carson says, this is where Rosa Parks doesn't even care about, and he's pointing to a picture in a book about her. And Terry says, okay. And Carson goes, when the bus driver said get up, and the teacher, Terry, says, okay, so you're saying she didn't care? And Carson said, yeah. Okay, she's not even looking at him, referring to the book picture. Rosa Parks is not even paying attention to the bus driver, and the bus driver, look how mad the bus driver is. He's like, Rosa Parks, look at me, and she won't. And she won't look at him? No. Why do you think Rosa Parks won't look at the bus driver? And Carson's response was, she wants to stay where she is, but she's going to get arrested. And so I think that this transcript shows that when he painted this image on the previous slide, that he had a purpose or an intentionality perhaps in how he drew Rosa's eyes, staring straight at the viewer, at us, and not facing the bus driver and looking at the bus driver in the eyes. And so being able to go back and trace the history, the conversations that Carson had had before he drew this picture helped me to understand that he knew Rosa was intentionally doing that. So the last tension I want to talk about is one that has come up in the chat area, and this is about meanings and intents with images. And like I said previously, I've had people ask me, how do you know what an image means, or how do you know if the child was intentional or meant to draw something in a particular way? And so this goes back to issues of truth. Is there a singular meaning that we're searching for in images that children draw? And is there a singular way of knowing versus multiple ways of knowing and multiple meanings within an image? If you look at the meaning and the interaction, what is the evidence that we would be able to say or document that this particular image means something? So what kind of data and evidence would I have to say in order to make a claim about what this child meant? And then the third point I bring up here is, does it really matter what the intention of the illustrator or the artist was and the emotional response that's invoked in each individual person? And I think a little bit about Rosenblatt's reader response theory with this. Rosenblatt talks about that each time that we come to a text or we read a text, that there's a different poem that's evoked. And I take that to mean that each time a person approaches a book, you might have a different experience or interpretation. And if you approach the book 6 months from now, you might have a different understanding then as well. And no two people would have the exact same response to a book. And I think about that related to art. So each of us that experience these images tonight have different responses to the emotions they evoke in us and the meanings that we make from them. So perhaps our focus as researchers might not always be on the intention of the author illustrator, but more on the evoked response in the viewer. And so I use this image as an example here. So this image at the bottom, you can see that there are several people that are drawn with a brown watercolor, and there are circles that are falling down next to their faces. And I've had people ask me, what do you think these circles are? And some have said, are they chains? Some have said, are they tears? And how do you know what it is? And I look back at the text that goes with this image, and it says, I looked around and saw that other black people had sad faces because Rosa was getting arrested. So I've made an assumption that these circles are tears, and they're huge tears. It just shows this emotional level. And if you look at the speech bubbles, some of the speech bubbles say sad, and the one in the middle, which you probably can't read, that's blue, says wah, like the sound that somebody would make when they're crying. So I don't have a way to know for certain what these round circles are, but if I look at the text, if I look at the speech bubbles, I think that those give me a clue in order to analyze these images. Oh, I love what Margaret just said, that she saw braids. Somebody asked who's the yellow character, and this is the bus driver, the yellow character down in the bottom. So I want to stop quickly and ask if there's any questions, and then I'm going to share with you what I created as an analytical framework to look at these images. But just since we've explored these 5 tensions, are there any questions that are surfacing before we move on?
If you have a question, just go ahead and type it in the chat area, and Candace will answer that. Candace, I just temporarily turned off your mic so we didn't get the reverberation. Candace, actually, I do have a question. Probably, why did you use paint as the mode for representing? Was there a reason for that?
Well, it was a program. We had very limited resources. All we had were crayons, markers, and watercolors. We didn't have tempera paint. We didn't have supplies like tissue paper or other three-dimensional kind of things that they could use. And so it was basically a limitation of what materials that were available at the summer program. So we chose paint because we had not used them a lot and the kids were interested in using them.
Karen writes, wondering if a child's drawn meaning needs to be one thing or another. Totally think it could be fluid, right?
Absolutely. So when I was teaching that summer, I didn't know that I wanted to analyze these books, and so I do have some conversations where I sat down with the students as they were drawing, but I often wonder if I was to go back and ask them a week later, 2 weeks later, what did this drawing mean, or what does this particular part of the drawing mean, if they would tell me something very different. And so I do think that there isn't a fixed or a set meaning, in that many times children tell us different responses to what they draw or what they write, at different times. And so I definitely see how the meanings could be fluid or change, perhaps, depending on when you sit down and talk with them about what they've drawn. Paul, I see your question. Can you tell us a little bit more what you mean by that? Well, I'm going to scoot on, but Paul, if you, let's see, you used Rosenblatt's there. She talks about literacy text. So I guess what I was thinking related to Rosenblatt is that notion of reading a text and having different poems or experiences evoked. And I do see that we read different modes. And so, for example, if you think of the scholarship on embodiment, that I think that our bodies can be a text that other people can read. And we read each other's bodies in different ways, and so there's different interpretations to that. I think that's the same when it comes to art, in the sense that we each experience the art in a different way, and we have different interpretations, perhaps, of the same image or the same piece of art. And so I think that we read these images, we read other modes, we read alphabetic print and writing as well. It's interesting. So I want to share with you now what I did after exploring these 5 tensions. This was the process I went through. These are 5 areas that I struggled and wrestled with. And then I want to share with you now what I came up with as my way of analyzing the images in the book that the children created. And so there were 2 specific theoretical positions that I decided to draw upon to analyze these images. One is the notion of sedimented text. And this comes from Jennifer Rousel and Kate Paul. They have a piece in the Reading Research Quarterly in 2007 where they talk about layered identities and how we have sedimented layers on the images, the art that children construct. And so they give several examples in that article, but the parts that I pull out from that is that the history and context of children's lives are sedimented or layered into what they create. And so I wanted to be able to take into account not just the painting itself, but to take into account the lives of the children, the experiences that they have, and how they brought that as they were painting these images. So the idea is to think about a text within a context, not just the text or the image itself. The other theoretical perspective that I drew upon, it was this notion of synesthesia, and it was a new term for me. Jennifer Rousel actually introduced it to me when we were looking through some of these images together, and it comes, or it's more, I guess, prominent in art, in the art and music world, but synesthesia is basically an involuntary joining of senses, and so it means 2 senses or more than 2 senses joined together. And so an example of this would be if you are a musician and you hear a B flat, and every time you hear a B flat, you see the color blue. And so you have the sense of hearing and the sense of sight that are combining together or are joined together. And so there's many artists and musicians who talk about having these experiences as they create, either musically or through the art that they're creating. The quote at the bottom by Boston, I think, was important for me and why I think it relates to my work, because they said that sensory perceptions have to arrive involuntarily, and it's an emotional response. And so this is what Jennifer Rousel, I think, was talking to me about with synesthesia, is that as we looked at the paintings that the kids drew related to Rosa Parks, is they evoked emotional responses to us, and they evoked multiple senses as we interacted with their drawings. And so I want to be clear with how I'm using this concept of synesthesia in my work. one way that I just mentioned is the artist's perspective, the way that they might hear a certain sound when they see a certain color. But it's also the experience that other people have with an image. So as you experience art, do you yourself have a synesthetic response to the art that you view? And this is how I'm using the term. So this is the analytical framework that I created to help me analyze the images in the book beyond just a visual grammar design analysis. And so there were three main areas or questions that I asked of each of the images as I went through analysis. And so in the left-hand column, you can see that I was asking of the images, in what ways does this illustration evoke a synesthetic response? And so I was looking for things like color, shape, and size, but I was looking to see how they use color, shape, and size to evoke some type of emotional response in myself and the viewer. And if I had multiple senses that were influenced by the image that I looked at. The second question I asked of the images or of the data is, how is this image or the text, the words written with it, agentic? And what I mean by that is, were there any indicators of the child using this image to show that they understand what was happening with racial segregation? Were they resisting dominant discourses? So thinking about art as a democratic act. What could I know about the student's voice, the student's understandings of political awareness? And so those were the questions I was thinking in the second layer of analysis. The third question I asked of the data is, what are the sentiment and meanings from the image? And so that draws upon Jennifer Rousel and Kate Paul's work. And so as I was looking at each image, I was also thinking about what were traces from our curriculum, from other conversations that we'd had related to Rosa Parks, thinking about the local and global discourses. So not only what happened in our classroom, but what were the larger discourses of growing up in the South, in a place where racial segregation happened several decades ago, and where there are still tensions of race in the world that they're growing up in. I was also thinking about what religious undertones and experiences they had that might influence the way that they illustrated these pictures. So I'll just stop for a second and see if there's any questions, and then I'll just show quickly two examples of how I use these three questions in the table to analyze the images in the book. Yes, Barbara, I'll share with you at the end that this work has been published in 2 places, and so there will be definitely a place at the end of the presentation where you could jot down a reference if you'd like to see this in an article format. All right, well, to move on, I just want to demonstrate this. So the three areas that I asked of the data, this is an image we looked at earlier. But the first question focuses on the synesthetic or evoked emotions in the viewer. And so as I was to experience this image that Hunter created, I was drawn to the large tears. I was also drawn to the skin tones that he chose and the speech bubbles. And for me, the speech bubbles really pulled out a sense of sympathy, also a sense of anger inside of me, because the words that Hunter chose was sad and wah, which to me indicates a crying. And so the synesthetic response I had while viewing this image was I could hear shouts of frustration from the people in the image, and I could also taste the saltiness of those tears. To me, I experienced those circles falling down from their faces as tears, and they're huge. And so the combination of the crying and the words that were used really evoked this frustrating feel in me and a sympathy for the experience of these people. Another part of this was the question number 2 looks at how does the student Hunter understand the critical inquiry that we were studying, so issues related to power, position, and privilege. And I thought it was interesting that he drew the people in a communal, collective space together. They weren't sitting on the seats of the bus, but they were standing together. And it has a very collective feel to this picture. I think he also shows very well the effects of power and of laws. And so by showing the sadness, he was able to understand how a law would make a group of people feel. The third question focuses on the sedimented histories. What did I know about Hunter to help me understand how he drew this picture? I noticed in the photos that were in the picture books we had read previously, none of them had pictures of people crying, which was kind of surprising to me.
Dr. Kuby began her career teaching early childhood students, spending more than a decade working with students in several national and international locations. She earned a doctorate in literacy, culture, and language education from Indiana University. Along with her many publications, research projects, presentations, and service to the profession, Dr. Kuby remains an active member in several professional organizations. Some of her many research interests include critical inquiry, qualitative research methods, and spatial literacy, to name a few. At present, Dr. Kuby continues work in literacy research at the University of Missouri, Columbia, where she is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning, Teaching, and Curriculum. She is also the author of several publications concerning language and literacy, so please feel free to check those out on the GCLR website. Several of them are on the screen before you. Without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Candace Kuby and her presentation entitled Tensions from Analyzing Children's Images of Racial Bus Segregation, Searching for Tools. Let's give her a virtual round of applause by clicking on the hand icon located on your under your participant screen underneath the participant window. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kuby now.
Candace, you may need to turn your mic back on.
Thank you, Peggy. Thanks, Christy. Can you all hear me now?
Good evening and welcome to tonight's Global Conversation in Literacy with Dr. Candace Kuby. We are hosting tonight from Georgia State University located in downtown Atlanta. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter at hashtag GCLR. Your moderators for this evening will be Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, and me, Christy Pace, doctoral student at Georgia State University. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. We are currently conducting research on the nature of technology-mediated interactions between and among participants within literacy-focused web seminars. The map indicates locations from where GCLR webinar participants interact. Everyone, if you would, please take a moment, locate the wand. It's a sparkly-looking device there to the left of the slide. Take your wand and click on the map from where you're listening at this time. Wow, it looks as though we have a cross-section of participants joining us from all over. We are delighted to have you with us in this evening's important literacy research conversation. And once again, if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, please type them into the chat area. Dr. Albers and I will monitor these as best we can during the presentation, during the webinar, and then at the conclusion of her presentation, Dr. Kuby will have an opportunity to address your questions as well. Seminars. Areas of interest include the issues, affordances, and constraints of this technology as it relates to GCLR. For more information on our seminars, please visit our website to learn about upcoming events, including the 2011-2012 series. Here you can also retrieve information about our presenters. We invite anyone interested in presenting a web seminar to please contact Dr. Peggy Albers at the email address you see here at the bottom of your screen. We want you to feel free to interact during the presentation. You may do this by typing in the chat area any questions and responses you may have during the webinar. Those of you who have joined us before will recognize this interactive map. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. And this cluster